Hi, I'd like to talk about child education, obviously the theme of this conference. And what I'd like to talk about today is a slightly more theoretical perspective about child development. Just to say a bit about myself, my name is Ted Dimon. I am the director of the Dimon Institute in New York City. I'm also an adjunct professor at Columbia Teachers College, where I have begun to introduce the subject of child development and Alexander's work into a course that I teach there. And I also have a doctoral student that I'm advising who is going to be speaking at the conference. So I'd like to also thank Sue Mary and Judith Kleiman for putting together such an important conference and spearheading what is one of the most important subjects in our work. So what I'd like to talk about is child development and use, or Alexander's work as it applies to child development, in particular as a broader subject. We all know that children use themselves in a harmful way. Alexander's work begins with that observation. And sadly, we see this more and more in children and at younger ages. Alexander also came up with a very practical method for addressing this, which can be applied quite directly in the classroom. And of course, I'm all in favor of this. The problem is, if all we do is apply Alexander's work in the classroom as a kind of a hands-on modality, we won't be describing the problem at a fundamental level that we're addressing in kids. And therefore, we won't be articulating it as a subject that needs to be recognized as an important aspect of child development. And that's what I want to say a little bit about. So I just want to share this image. Here's a child under 1 year old, 1 year of age, sitting very beautifully. He's in a playground with water on him. This child is not able to walk, and you could see even his sitting balance is a little bit shaky, and that's why the parents, you can see the parents' hands very nearby, because he's afraid the child is on stone. He doesn't want the child to fall over. We can see in a child at this age what beautiful natural poise the child has. You could say that the muscular system is working perfectly, really, in so many ways. And yet by the age of 4 or 5, in most children, the perfect working of this system will be completely lost. Now, obviously, a 4 or 5-year-old, particularly when they begin to work in school at real tasks like doing subject matter, obviously, they're engaging in far more complex activities than this infant. And so we would expect complexities in how the child's functioning. But this isn't the real reason. Every child inherits a system, an upright system, just as perfect as we see in this infant. And it's far more than posture, because for that system to work properly, the child has to, the system has to be working in such a way that muscles all over the body are lengthening in order that that child can maintain upright support with as little effort as possible, and that's part of its design. So articulating how that mechanism works, to me, is a foundational aspect of what Alexander discovered. He didn't just discover that there's sort of a head-neck relationship, as we see in this child, that helps to organize the child's posture better than if the child is slumping. He actually made the beginnings of a discovery of how that upright system functions as the foundation for everything that child will do in sitting and standing, including more complex activities. A second element that I think is important to mention is that when a child is not at this age, but when you have, let's say, a 4 or 5-year-old who is sitting in a chair, and you get the 4 or 5-year-old balanced quite nicely, and you restore, if they're slumping, you restore their poise such that they're able to do something more effortlessly like this infant. It turns out that the problem has another component, which is even more subtle and complex than the working of that system, which is that the child will revert to its old way and harmful way of doing things because the working of that postural system is directly connected with the action mechanism. And at that level, you can no longer separate the working of the physical system from the child's engagement or intention to act. And we have to begin to describe what appears to be a postural or physical problem as a psychophysical problem. So the second element is that the working of that system, which appears to be more or less a physical problem, turns out to be a complex psychophysical problem. A third element that I want to mention is that when that child engages that total psychophysical mechanism, it always happens in response to the intention to do something. So even in the example of this infant, you could see that he is attending to the water, and his intention or his attention to the water and his intention to play in some way with the water is part of what engages that system. If he falls asleep, the system won't work in the same way. In other words, the working of his postural system and how it works as a psychophysical whole are both directly connected with the attention level of the child, so that you could say that the attention, in a way, is the leading level of what the child does at the physical and psychophysical level. I'm focusing here on the visual, but it could be attention in other ways as well. The attention aspect of it is particularly important because when you work with a 5 or 6-year-old and you see them engaging in an activity in a harmful way, it's never purely physical or even psychophysical in the sense that they've engaged harmful habits. It's always going to involve some element or disturbance in attention level, because a child that's beginning to write in a harmful way and that's beginning to tighten and interfere with his or her posture will also be overly preoccupied or overly focused on what they're doing. So that you could say that the problem has as much to do with attention as it has to do with the working of the physical and psychophysical system. The other side of the coin of a child focusing too intensely and too narrowly on what he or she is doing is dispersed attention, where you see children, particularly who are very sedentary and who are being forced to sit for long periods in school and beginning to experience being disengaged and disinterested. You see that they begin to become unfocused in their attention level. And this also is associated with the working of the physical system, so that we see two extremes of kind of disturbance in attention, one too focused and one too unfocused, that are part of how the system works. So these three elements taken together, the working of the physical system or the system of poise or posture, the psychophysical working of that system in action as both a behavioral and a physical system, and the attention level, the three of these things together constitute what I would call the psychophysical functioning of the child, or the psychophysical health of the child. And as a general rule, this aspect of how the child functions is ignored in typically developing children. So we are often quite aware of how a child is developing cognitively, and if there are problems, we pick them up fairly quickly. We're often quite aware of child's emotional development, and certainly there's been a huge literature on each of these areas. But we have very little real understanding of this aspect of psychophysical functioning as a whole. And in fact, because we tend to view it or to minimize it or trivialize it as posture, we tend to think of it as not being important to a child's development. But what I think is important to mention is that when we begin to see that what appears to be just sort of harmful or bad posture is really disturbing a really beautiful and important system working in the child, and that system in turn is connected up with a whole functional series of functions, then we would have to describe that as being equally important in a child's development to emotional and cognitive development or cognitive function. And these elements together make up what I would call the holistic or psychophysical functioning of a child that needs to be monitored as a basis for assessment in children, just as we monitor cognitive and emotional development. And I think I used to think that just describing it as psychophysical was sufficient to grab the attention of educators, but we have so many different ways of looking at psychophysical that it's just simply too vague. When we begin with the concrete perspective of how that system works in a child, and then from there see how much it's involved in how the child is engaged in activities, we realize that it's an aspect of child development that is crucial and needs to be part of our assessment of children and not just something that we practically address in the classroom. And one final point I want to make is that I think in particularly our Western tradition, we're so preoccupied with learning as a cognitive act that we don't place value on this. But I think perhaps there's a changing mindset, because now we realize that these elements are leading to so many problems in children that we have to take it into account. And I hope other people at the conference will say, will look at other aspects of this problem in children. And I would love to hear from people after everyone has had a chance to speak. And thank you for your attention.